Good morning, everyone, or afternoon if you are outside of the United States. So today I want to talk about how do you know when to use what kind of play therapy theory model with your clients. So we're talking about clinical decision making today as it relates to figuring out which play therapy model to use and which expressive arts to use. Um, so I'm Kathy Spooner, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a registered play therapist supervisor here in the United States with almost 30 years experience working with children, adolescents, and adults. And I love using play therapy and expressive arts, especially Santre, art and poetry in my clinical work with clients, as you can see from the Santre miniatures behind me. So let's see who's here today. Go ahead and post in the comments. Let's see who's here. Post your name, where you're from. I'd love to know what are some of the types of presenting issues of clients that you see in the program where you work. What are some of the issues that your clients are struggling with that they come to see you? Post those in the comments and let's see what are some of the issues that you guys are dealing with. Also, what kind of program do you work in? Do you work in an outpatient? Are you an outpatient program? Sorry, I have something stuck in my throat today. Um, are you working in um, a school setting? Are you working in intensive outpatient, hospitalization, residential? What kind of program are you working in? And post those in the comments. Let's see who's here. Let's see where you're working. And what kind of issues are you dealing with in the program? What are the ages of the kids that you're working with in your program? So today I want to talk about, I'm going to share some of my thoughts and opinions about what are some of the things to consider when you're trying to decide what theory model to use with play therapy and expressive arts. So if you're kind of new to play therapy is so the way that I describe play therapy is it's using the therapeutic powers of play with a specific type of theoretical model. I always say there's probably as many fundamental theoretical models for play therapy as there are with some of the adult treatment models. Um, the ones that I use are child-centered play therapy, which is based on the work of Carl Rogers and integrating that to work with children using the therapeutic powers of play. And then I use some other types of models as well. So those are the things that we need to think about when we're providing treatment to our clients. I always say to the people that I supervise, our job is, and I say this to my clients as well, my job is to work myself out of a job, meaning my job is to help figure out what is going on with my clients and then figure out what type of interventions, what theoretical models do I think will work most effectively to help my clients overcome those issues and successfully discharge from treatment. So the clinical decision making process is essentially an ongoing process. I I like to use the term like I'm a super sleuth. I go into detective mode. That's my clinical case conceptualization. And then based on that, I'm making decisions about how fast or slow to go in the treatment process. I'm making decisions about what type of interventions to use. I'm making decisions about who to involve in the treatment process, who do I need to coordinate with. So these are all the things that go into that clinical decision making process. especially when we're working with children and adolescents, because we need to think about them within the context of their lives, meaning children come with families and their families may vary. Maybe their families are a two-parent family where they all live in the same home. Maybe they're a family that's divorced or separated and they're across two homes. Maybe the children are no longer in the care of their biological parents, and maybe they're in foster care, or maybe they've been adopted and they live with their adopted family, or maybe their adopted family divorced and separated. So many things to think about when we're conceptualizing children in context, because we also need to make sure that we're conceptualizing beyond the family system. So, for example, we're conceptualizing them. How are they doing at school? Are they on grade level? Are they beyond grade level? Are they gifted? Do they have a learning disability? Do they get along with their teachers? How are they behaving at school? How do they do with their peers? Are there other contexts that they're involved with in their lives? For example, are they in sports? Are they in a church community? How are they doing across all of these different areas of their lives? And we're thinking about those things as we're making decisions as well, who to involve. We're getting information about how they're doing in those areas. So all of that goes into deciding as we're conceptualizing our clients. And then from there, that information, we decide on what kind of interventions we want to use. And as we're going through the treatment process, we are learning more about our clients. I always like to use the analogy, it's like doing some remodeling on your home. You never know what's behind the walls or underneath the floors until you get in there and start taking things apart. And then you get a better idea of what's going on, and you're making decisions about how to help your clients resolve those issues. So these are all the things that we're thinking about. Some of the things, so what I want to do is I'm going to go through some of the things that I think about, and then I'm going to switch over to my PowerPoint and I'm going to break it down a little bit more. So if you're just joining us now, go ahead and post your name and where you're from in the comments. I'd love to see who's here. Also, what types of presenting issues are you working with in your treatment program, and what kind of program do you work in? So go ahead and post those in the comments. If you're watching on the replay, love to hear what some of the presenting issues are that you're working with, and what kind of program do you work in. So one of the first things that I think about when I am trying to decide what theoretical model is, what are the presenting issues, and what theoretical model works well with that presenting issue. For example, if I'm working with someone who has trauma, then I may want to consider more of a trauma-informed treatment model that's going to address some of those cognitive distortions. We're going to have to do some of that, figuring out what the trauma triggers are, doing some restructuring of some of those cognitive distortions, helping them use their coping skills when their triggers do get activated. So we want to think about those things. If it's anxiety, then we're probably looking at some directive play therapy interventions to use some cognitive restructuring for that. So some CBT types of things, or even DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. We also want to think about what is the age and development of the child, and what play therapy or expressive arts interventions work more effectively with that age. So for example, I'm trained to use child-centered play therapy. So when I work with really young children, like definitely 7 and under, then I'm most likely going to be using child-centered play therapy as my main modality. And the younger my clients are, so I'll work with children as young as 3. The younger they are, the more likely I'm going to strictly use child-centered play therapy. What kind of theoretical model and way of being with your client works most effectively based on their personality? Some kids are more quiet and reserved. Some kids are more, let's just say, extroverted. They like to engage, they like to connect. So I always like to think about those things to help me in my decision about how to be in the session. And am I going to be still and quiet with them because I don't want to overwhelm them, especially in the beginning? Or do I really need to engage with them verbally to help them connect with me when I'm starting and developing that therapeutic rapport? And then I kind of see how that goes through the treatment process. The other is, what theoretical play therapy and expressive arts models am I trained to use? One of the things I talk a lot about in my online play therapy supervision group is a lot of these things. What works well with that presenting issue? What's the age and development of the child? That's a big one. And then the other thing is, what theoretical models are you trained to use? And then we talk about how they use those theoretical models. Like, how do you apply them? Because theory drives application, and application means you really have to think about your client and how it fits specifically with that client and that presenting issue. So we talk a lot about that in my supervision group, and people that I supervise really figuring out how to apply these theoretical models and do that clinical decision making with each of their clients. And then the other thing is, finally, to me, is therapeutic rapport. That therapeutic relationship, I really feel like that's kind of the glue for whatever theoretical model that you're using. So we really want to balance both. We don't want to get so heavy into the skills and the application that we forget about the relationship. That healing aspect of the therapeutic relationship is really, really important, because that's how we help our clients feel heard, feel understood, and feel cared about within those the therapeutic boundaries of the relationship. We are working on building that therapeutic rapport to be fully present and aware and connected with our clients in the treatment process. That helps build that sense of safety and that free and protected space where they can feel comfortable and safe engaging in the change process, because they're not going to do that unless they feel safe. All right, so let me go ahead. Check my notes. I am going to share my screen. I'm getting better at this. Hopefully I'll do it right. All right, here we go. And I cannot see comments while I'm sharing my screen. So go ahead and post the comments, because when I'm done sharing the screen, I can still see those. All righty. Here we go. Sharing. I think I'm getting the hang of this sharing. This part is always weird on the other side. Like, you guys see my screen there. It's really kind of wacky. All righty. So what are we talking about today? We are talking about that clinical decision making, how to know what kind of play therapy or expressive arts modality to use. One of the things, what I think about, actually a couple of the things that I really think you have to think about is, you need to think about what's your training and your expertise, making sure that you're trained to use play therapy and expressive arts, trained in different theoretical models, how those models are applied with your clients. That's really important, because we want to make sure that we're grounding the work that we do with our clients based on a theoretical model, as we're doing that clinical decision making about how that's applied, the pacing, and all of those kinds of things. Most of us use an integrated approach. Um, I'm a firm believer that one size really doesn't fit all. And any of those modalities that we're trained to use, we need to make sure, any of those modalities that we use, we need to make sure that we're trained how to use them. And then the other big thing is, what of those modalities that you're trained in, which ones are appropriate and effective for the issue that your client is coming to you with and the age of your client. Those are really important things to consider. So, here are some things to think about when you're thinking about play therapy and expressive arts. Are you targeting cognitive distortions that are activating anxiety, depression, or defiance? Because if that's the case, you probably want to think about some CBT type of strategies, and those are going to be using more directive play therapy and expressive arts. So you want to make sure how those, the theory behind those, because that's how you apply do the application piece. So the other thing to think about is, are you working on restructuring cognitive distortions that are activating shame, guilt, maybe some trauma memories? If that's the case, you want to probably think about using more trauma-informed directive play therapy or expressive arts interventions. There are different ones. My training using trauma with play therapy, I really like the model that I was trained in. It's through the National Institute for Trauma and Loss in Children. It One of the things that I like about that model is it takes into consideration and accesses the sensory aspect of trauma. And to me, that's a really important thing, because trauma is activated, those memories and those triggers are activated through a lot of times those sensory memories that they may or may not have access to through their cognitive capacities at the time, or even language at the time. They may not necessarily understand. They'll get triggered. That hijacks their brain, because now they're in the fight, flight, or freeze mode because their trauma has been triggered, and they're not going to be able to access the cognitive parts in that moment. We want them to eventually get there so that they can recognize what's going on. And I think using play therapy and expressive arts to access the sensory part of trauma is really, really important. So if you're interested in that model, it's the National Institute for Trauma and Loss in Children. It's a structured sensory intervention. They have a structured process that they go through. They do a lot of really good trainings. It's really good. The other thing that you want to think about is, are you working on attachment relationships? Does your child, because think about them, they're in context. And if we're thinking about them in context, they have some attachment figures. How are they doing with their attachment figures? Are they able to use their attachment figures for that co-regulation when they get dysregulated? Are parents reading those cues effectively to know how to co-regulate their child? Are the kids, even adolescents? I really think in adolescents, we need to think about them in context of their family relationships. And because this is the family they're going to have forever, whether or not they're connected with them, this is still their family. And all of those attachment working models are still in there. So if we can target those earlier and make some effective changes earlier, then that only benefits our client and their families, because they are going to be able to engage in healthy relationships, use each other for support, their sense of who they are, their sense of belonging. All of that really matters. So are you working on some of those attachment relationships? If you are, you may want to consider theraplay or filial therapy, or even attachment-focused family play therapy. That's a model that I developed because I liked having a way of having a little more freedom with my clinical decision-making to integrate in family members. I really don't think we pay enough attention to those sibling relationships, because I really feel like sibling relationships are really, if they can access those for support, that's awesome. But also I always think about sibling relationships in terms of like, this is how we learn how to deal with peers in many ways. So, and trust peers, engage in healthy relationship with peers. So if we can integrate in siblings and reinforce and help with those healthy relationships and attachments within the family system, I just think that's a really important thing that we can help our clients with. Because again, we're looking at long term, my job is to work myself out of a job and to help my client not need me anymore and be able to navigate life within their system, with their caregivers, with their family relationships, with their support people. So to me, that's an important part of the work that we do with children and adolescents. I want to think about what's the age of the child. Because if it's a really young child, I probably want to use child-centered play therapy because I think that one is much more effectively geared towards their developmental needs and treatment. Or if they're a little bit older, then I probably am looking at a different kind of treatment model that probably is even more directive in its approach. Just kind of depends on what their needs are. So these are some of the things I'll probably think about. The other thing is, like I mentioned before, how are you going to involve the parents or caregivers or other family members? Are you going to do parent coaching sessions without the child present? Are you going to use theraplay, filial therapy, attachment focused family play therapy? Which ones of those those are some things you may want to consider. I'm a little distracted. I can hear my dog in the background digging. So if you hear weird noises, panting and digging ferociously, that is my crazy little dog, Lily. All right. So the other thing that you want to think about is, are you working on social skills? Is that the presenting issue? Maybe you have a child who's got some autism spectrum and they don't know how to navigate those social nuances and social relationships. Or maybe you have a child with ADHD and they're really hyperactive and it's hard for them to slow down enough to kind of figure out what's going on. Maybe they're super bossy and they don't wait their turn. So you can use play therapy to help. And these are probably going to be more directive based on the age. Maybe some social skills. Do they need a social skills group? Are you going to work on them one-on-one? And if you're working on social skills, the likelihood you need to integrate the parents is pretty high, in my opinion, because parents or caregivers are key to helping them generalize those skills to their everyday lives. And they can help advocate at school, set some things up at school, maybe with the school counselor or the school social worker, how to use and apply those skills in their everyday lives in the moment. And you are going to need parents and caregivers and teachers and school counselors in order to help you do that. So how are you going to set that up? So those are some of the things to think about in that clinical decision-making process. And we're thinking about those and adjusting our decision-making as we go through the treatment process, because as we get to know our clients, we're going to get to know them better. We're going to see what works, what doesn't work. We're going to be adjusting. We may want to switch to a different model. All of these things we want to think about as we're making decisions about what type of modality and interventions to use with our clients. So just application. So last week I introduced my fictitious client, Sam, who is 6 years old. So I'm going to talk about him a little bit more today. And Sam, fictitious client Sam, is presenting with emotion dysregulation. So Sam, his presenting issue is that he has emotion dysregulation, and through the case conceptualization, what we've learned is that he does struggle with ADHD, and part of his ADHD is emotion dysregulation, and he has trouble with his peers, and he has a hard time waiting his turn, and he's really struggling with the impact of these things on his self-esteem. So he kind of feels like he's a bad kid. Nobody wants to play with him. He doesn't really understand why. These are all some of the things that have come out in the psychosocial assessment and the clinical case conceptualization. So what treatment model do I think about using when I'm working with Sam? So he's 6 years old, and one of the things we know about children with ADHD, especially if they haven't really had a lot of treatment interventions, is they tend to be a little more socially, emotionally behind the curve. So even though he may be chronologically 6, it's possible he may be socially and emotionally a little younger. The other thing to think about too is, in this case, in my case conceptualization of Sam, he's also gifted. So even though chronologically he's 6 years old and socially, emotionally, I've determined he's a little behind the development because he doesn't wait his turn. He's really impulsive. He dysregulates because he's still learning how to regulate his emotions more effectively. And that's part of his ADHD presentation, as he struggles that a little bit based on his neural wiring. But he's also cognitively a little more advanced than his same age peers. So maybe in reading and his ability to use language and conceptualize vocabulary and meaning, he may be more like an 8-year-old. So he may be a little ahead of his peers in some ways and a little more delayed in other ways. And one of the things that we think about when we have a gifted child is they have what we call an asynchronous development anyway, because even though they're chronologically one age, cognitively, they're a little more advanced than their peers. So in some ways, they're used to understanding things and getting things right away. But in other ways, if it's not an area where their gifted intelligence is what that they're a higher cognitive functioning, so maybe like math, Sam is on grade level and he has to work to learn the concepts. So that might be a little frustrating for him, and he may be more impatient and cranky. Some of those ways. So we have all these things that we're thinking about with Sam, and he's 6, and it's affecting his self-esteem. Like he thinks he's a bad kid. He's always getting in trouble. Nobody wants to play with him. So typically with this age, I tend to use child-centered play therapy because it gives them the ability to be in control. It gives me an idea using that model. I look at how they're using the toys. I look at what they're doing with the toys. I look at the themes in their play with the toys. I look at their interactions with me. I look at all of those things and figure out how to apply child-centered play therapy with Sam. And this is a lot of what we talk about in my supervision group. So I have an online supervision group, and we talk about these things, doing a lot of this clinical decision making. How do we take child-centered play therapy and apply that for this specific client? We look at what are the themes in the play. We do that clinical decision making about how to make sure we're pacing with our client, we're understanding what's going on, we're recognizing what phase of the treatment process they're in, conceptualizing it from the child-centered play therapy model. So these are all the things that we're thinking about. I may also want to think about filial play therapy or even theraplay if the child and the parent have a disconnection in their relationship, and the child is not able to effectively use their parent for that co-regulation. So there's that disconnect and a little discord there, because if you've got a child who presents like Sam and you're a parent, they're challenging, they're exhausting, they need some help. And so that's part of the support that we can give to parents. I am most definitely going to want to help parents engage in the treatment process. I'll probably also do some parent coaching, especially in the beginning without the child present, because in those sessions, I want to find out how the client is doing. I want to find out what happens after the sessions. I want to find out what happens before the sessions. I want to find out how parents are dealing with that and how the kids are responding to that. So those are things that I can get in the parent coaching sessions. I may want to think about some attachment-based family play therapy, because if Sam's relationships with his siblings and in his family system, they're just kind of pinging off each other, then I most definitely want to get the family in there and see what's going on and maybe help realign some of those relationships and help family members engage with each other in a healthier way and tolerate each other when they're not being their most fabulous. So those are some of the things that I think about when I have a client who's somewhat similar to the presentation like Sam is showing. The other client that we met last time was Tommy. Tommy's my fictitious 9-year-old client who has a history of trauma. So in the case conceptualization, let's say for Tommy, we learned that his parents had some domestic violence going on. Maybe Tommy's father had an addiction to drugs and parents argued a lot about it. And when Tommy's dad was under the influence of drugs, he was really aggressive, and his style of discipline was really heavily kind of punishment based and physically abusive, harsh physical treatment, tossing Tommy up against the wall when Tommy didn't do what he said. And Tommy's way of dealing with all of this was he got mad and angry, so it would make him more angry and he'd act out. And the way dad would handle that is dad would get physically aggressive with him. And he would witness the arguing and the pushing and the dad being physically aggressive with mom, which felt scary. All of that felt scary. So his way of dealing with it was he would be angry and dysregulated and kind of defiant. So one of the things that I'm going to be thinking about with a client such as Tommy, he's 9, he can use more cognitively, he can access more of those parts of his brain and verbally interact with me. He's also a boy, so I'm going to want to assess if he can tolerate a lot of the verbal interaction, or does he need more kind of play-based, lots of active. I think about those things with girls as well. Most definitely, I find there are some gender differences in the play therapy process, so I do want to see what those are and how those are manifesting in the play therapy process, and then make my decision about what type of interventions to use. So sometimes like expressive arts, that's art, it's sand tray. Sand tray is a lot more interactive because you pick the miniatures and you set them in there. Art is still uses some of that physical, because you're painting or you're coloring. It is a little more sedentary and not quite as active as maybe a play therapy game. So I want to think about those things, what works best, because I want to figure out what some of those triggers are for Tommy. First and foremost, what kind of activities can I use that are going to help him feel safe? Because the likelihood he's going to have a little bit of a time trusting me as a grown-up that he doesn't know in a place where he doesn't know, he's going to probably be a little more kind of activated, on alert, so to speak. So first and foremost, my job is most definitely to create a safe space for him. And I want to think about what kind of play therapy interests. Does he like art? Or does he like games? So I'm going to choose interventions that are more geared towards that. I'll probably be using more directive because he can handle that. And when I'm using directive, though, I want to think about what his interests are. What's his personality wiring? Is he quiet? Is he talkative? I want to think about those things, how I engage with him, and what types of directive play therapy interventions I'm going to use. And most likely, because he's 9 years old and he's experienced some trauma, I'm probably going to be using more of an integrated approach. So I may start out to create that safe, secure space. I may start out with child-centered play therapy. My experience with 9-year-olds is that tracking begins to get annoying for them with child-centered play therapy. So it's not too long before they're looking at me and yelling at me like, why are you talking that way? Stop talking that way. And they get irritated with me. So I'm probably not going to want to continue that because I'm going to be just making them mad all the time, which is not going to be helpful for the therapeutic relationship. So I want to think about those things in the beginning. I want to establish safety and security. I'll probably start out giving him control in the play therapy session using child-centered play therapy to establish safety and security. And then from there, that also helps me get to know him a little bit better. And I get a sense of what may or may not work well with him in terms of play therapy activities, expressive arts activities, and see which one he's more inclined to want to use. And then I'm going to want to explore with him developing an emotion vocabulary, developing some coping skills. And from there, we're going to start kind of figuring out what are some of his cognitive distortions. Once he feels safe and secure and comfortable in the session, we've kind of developed that foundation. And then eventually we're going to be wanting to move into some of that cognitive restructuring. Also, because children heal best within the context of families, trauma affects relational capabilities for children, like their ability to trust because of the traumatic experience gets impacted. So I most definitely am going to want to figure out how I'm going to integrate the parents or the caregivers and the family into the treatment process. So I may want to think about theraplay or filial therapy. More likely, I will probably do some attachment-based family play therapy. I'll start out with maybe doing some attachment-based interventions and activities between the parent and the child because I want to see how they are able to work together. I will have first, before I start integrating the family in, I probably would have had some parent coaching sessions without Tommy present, just to do a little psychoeducation with parents about trauma triggers, about attachment and attachment-based parenting and co-regulation. I will have wanted to do all of that first to build that foundation with parents. And then we'll probably slowly begin to integrate in more of the attachment-based family play therapy and see who needs to be in those sessions and what interventions, what types of directive interventions do I want to use in those sessions. And then periodically, I'll meet with parents without the child present to do some of that parent coaching, building that therapeutic rapport with parents. That is key to getting them to trust me and engage in the process as well. Because any parent who's bringing their child to treatment most likely feels like they've kind of failed their child in some way. So I most definitely want to build that rapport with parents. So again, these are all the things that we talk about in my play therapy supervision group. We'll talk about the presenting issues, especially with Tommy. We'll look at what's going on, what his triggers are. We'll come up with interventions about maybe what might work at different phases of the treatment process. We're making decisions and thinking about that clinical decision making of where he is in the treatment process, where the parents are, how to build that rapport with the parents, how to talk to the parents about their child's progress, and help get parents engaged in that change process as the therapeutic agents of change, especially when we're dealing with trauma. That's very, very important. I really believe that's important anytime that we're working with kids, is we want to help parents be those therapeutic agents of change for their child. So those are just some of the ways in which I go through that clinical decision-making process about play therapy and expressive arts. I am going to stop sharing my screen. There we go. I think that worked. Nope. There we go. I'm back. Hi, Gabe. See you there. Hello. Good morning. I'm glad you're here. All righty. And here's the thing. What if your interventions are not working? What do you do then? And this is a lot of what we talk about in my supervision group. What if they're not working? Because sometimes they feel like they're not working. When that happens, I always suggest, first and foremost, let's go back to the basics of the theoretical model that we're using with our clients. Are we applying it accurately? That's first and foremost. The other thing is, maybe the theoretical model that I chose isn't necessarily the one. Once I get in there and we get to know each other and I'm seeing more of what's going on, maybe that might not be the one that I chose, might not be the most effective to work with that child. So I may want to think about, is there a different play therapy and expressive arts that maybe will work a little bit better? Maybe I also, because think about it, it's like that remodeling. We don't really remodeling our house. We don't really know what's going on until we get in there and we take the walls down and we pull the floors up and we pull the plumbing out and we see what's going on. So maybe once we've gotten into the treatment process a little bit more, we realize, oh, maybe there's something going on. Kind of like Shrek. He gave the analogy, Shrek, I'm like an onion. I come in layers. Our clients come in layers. We come in layers. There's lots of different aspects about us. So those are the things that we're thinking about as we're in that process, getting to know our clients, seeing what works, what doesn't work, what modalities am I trained in? Am I applying those accurately? Maybe I might have missed something. And now that we're in the treatment process a little bit more, I can see there are some other things going on. As some things get better, other things become more clear and they kind of rise to the surface. So we want to be on the lookout for those. Do we miss anything? What else might be going on? Who else might I need to integrate into the treatment process? How am I integrating parents in the treatment process? How am I helping them be the therapeutic agents of change for their child? Do I need to involve anybody else? Do I need to coordinate with school staff? All of these things, I want to think about all of these things. And maybe I've missed some areas. Maybe I haven't been integrating parents as much as I need to. Maybe I haven't really helped parents engage as the therapeutic agents of change. And maybe I need to target there a little bit more. We usually talk about that one a lot in my supervision group. All righty. So that is it for today. Just a little recap. So when you're thinking about the clinical decision making, what type of play therapy and expressive arts to use, think about the age and the development of the child and what's some of their personality wiring in the presenting issues, because I want to adjust to those for my client so that I can meet them where they are with the intervention that's going to help me work myself out of a job so they can successfully discharge the treatment process. The other thing is, what models am I trained to use? And am I using them accurately? Am I learning under the supervision of another person, an experienced supervisor? What's the training and experience of that supervisor? Because then my supervisor's only going to be able to teach me what my supervisor is trained and experienced using. So I want to think about those things as well. And am I applying those, the theory models, effectively with my clients? And then finally, it's really, really important to engage parents in the treatment process. Are you thinking about how you're integrating them in? What type of model are you going to use to integrate parents and maybe even family members in? I'll be honest, when I'm supervising people and I make the suggestion of, let's do some attachment-based family play therapy. Normally, they'll look at me like I just said, hey, let's go bungee jumping. Let's jump off of a bridge. That terrified look in their face. And to me, it's important. I mean, honestly, what better way to see what's going on in your client's life than see them in the context of their family? I like getting everybody in there because then I get a better sense of that child and that family, and I can see what their strengths are, because I definitely want to build on those, and I can see where they might be struggling, and those are some areas where we target for change to help them engage in a different way that's healthier and going to be more beneficial to the family and to my client. So I definitely want to think about, how am I conceptualizing? What approach am I using to engage parents and family into the treatment process? Because maybe if they're not progressing, if my client's not progressing, I might not have engaged parents to the extent that I needed to. I might need to engage parents to be that therapeutic agent of change for my client. And finally, therapeutic rapport. And while I'm doing all this decision making, while I'm using different theoretical models and I'm applying those, I have to make sure that I'm maintaining that therapeutic rapport with my client, because that is the glue that holds it all together to help them successfully work their way through the treatment process. So that is it for today. All righty. So just if you're interested, I do have 1 or 2 spots left in my play therapy supervision group. It's online. We meet twice a month on a Saturday. We do a lot of case conceptualization, a lot of clinical decision making, processing. We will share ideas. So you not only have my 30 years of experience plus, because prior to working in mental health, I worked as a special education teacher in a self-contained classroom for children with emotional problems and learning disabilities, which is, by the way, where I learned about play therapy back in the 1980s. So I do have space available in my supervision group. If you're interested in my group, go ahead and private message me or post in the comments here. You can also go on my website. Let me find it. Here it is. If you want to go on my website, rrhcounseling.com, you can contact me through my website. Also, if you go on my website, you'll see a copy of how you can access my book, which is Attachment-Focused Family Play Therapy and Intervention for Children and Adolescents After Trauma. And I kind of really spell out my attachment-based family play therapy model. So if you're interested in that, you can go on my website and you can see how you can get a copy of the book. And then also, finally, if you're interested, because part of deciding on what treatment model that you're using is based on what treatment models you are trained to use. So I do have, I'm in Southern Nevada, about 90 miles, kind of northeast-ish of Las Vegas, right on the Arizona and Utah border. It's beautiful here. I have an in-person training coming up in November, the first weekend in November. We do a lot of processing and a lot of practice, recognizing what to look for in the sand tray, how to hold what you find in the sand tray, so to speak, how to help your clients process what is the potential of the meaning of the way in which they use their miniatures and arrange them, and what they used and how they used them and what they said or what they didn't say, all of those things. We do a lot of practice with that, holding and processing sand trays, making your own sand trays, because I think that's an invaluable way of learning sand tray therapy. So if you're interested, I will post a link in the comments for that upcoming sand tray training, November 6th and 7th here in Southern Nevada. And that is it for today. And I will see you next time. Bye.